Hola, hola. Hello. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Hola and welcome. I am Ana Flores. I am the co-founder and CEO of We All Grow Latina. We All Grow Latina was founded in 2010 based on a simple yet revolutionary idea to build a community of authentic voices and connections for Latinas to increase visibility and grow our social and economic power. We stand strong in our mission of elevating the voices and stories of Latinas via the power of community through culturally relevant content, virtual and in-person spaces, and events to bring together a sisterhood and a brotherhood of the most influential Latino creatives, entrepreneurs, and professionals. And in that spirit, today, we are incredibly proud to host La Historia Uncovered, created by Julissa Arce, a best-selling author of My Underground American Dream and Someone Like Me. La Historia Uncovered is a series of thought-provoking conversations led by best-selling author Julissa Arce with guest authors and journalists that will inspire us and strengthen our knowledge of the deep roots and history of our community here in the US. Today is the first of 4 conversations of this weekly interview series. This is a true community effort in partnership with Latino Rebels, BESE, and Puede, so that together we can uncover the lesser known history of the Latinx community in America during Latinx Heritage Month, which starts today. So, Julissa, bienvenida.
Thank you so much. I am super excited, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I just really, Anna, I just want to give you the biggest hug when this pandemic is over, because I couldn't have launched La Historia Uncovered without you. And of course, also thank you to all of our partners, Latino Rebels, Puede, BESE, and thank you to each of you that is tuning in and that has a desire to learn together, because that's what La Historia Uncovered is about. It's about us learning together. Just one quick note before we get started about the series. So the series is a 4-part series. And while we tried to have a range of conversations and a range of topics about lesser known Latino history, it is impossible that in 4 episodes we would cover every part of Latino history. And I think that just goes to show the deep, long cultural and historical ties that we have to this country. And so I hope that all of you will love this series so much that we'll have to do a second season where we can add more voices and add more conversations. If you are going to tweet about it or post about it, which I hope that you do, please use the hashtag La Historia Uncovered. And my Instagram handle and Twitter are both at Julissa Arce. So over the past few months, I have been doing a lot of reading of Latinx history books, as I have been doing research for my next book, Rejecting Assimilation. My book doesn't come out until next year, but as I was reading books like An African American and Latinx History of the United States, which was written by our guest, Dr. Paul Ortiz, I got really sad. Then I got really angry, and then I was incredibly inspired. I was sad because it made me realize all the history that was robbed from us, all of the pain that our ancestors went through, the majesty of our heroes, and the nuances of our history. And then I got angry because everything our people have endured without us even knowing. And then mostly, though, I was really, really inspired because those stories that we don't know break down any walls that exist between us and this land. So I'm going to make a very quick introduction of Dr. Paul Ortiz. He is a professor of history and the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. And he is the author of Emancipation Betrayed, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, and co-editor of the oral history Remembering Jim Crow. Paul, welcome to the program.
Julissa, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here with you this evening. It's so exciting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to get right into it because we have so much to cover. I mean, we're only really I'm focusing the conversation really on the early chapters of your book because it's so much and they're so rich. And so I just want to get right to it. But first, I just want to say thank you for joining us. And most importantly, thank you for writing such an incredible book that has really helped me to reimagine our country and what's possible once we know the history that was never taught to us. So to get right into it, one of my favorite lines from the book is when you say that stories are the opposite of walls. They demand release, and each image chips away at boundaries. So why did you feel that this story of African Americans and Latinx people in the United States needed to be told, and told in a way where you weave in the stories of Latinx people and African Americans, while at the same time telling each individual story with so much care and so much nuance? But why was this story important for you to tell?
Well, Julissa, it's a personal story. It's also a story about my ancestors, my comrades in the struggle. I first really learned how to be a movement historian working with the United Farm Workers of Washington State in the Chateau Saint Michel boycott struggle in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's also a story really dedicated to, if I think back in my own life history as a student, and I work today with so many first generation college students. I just did a workshop with a group of wonderful high school students in Florida. And they tell me the same thing. We don't know any stories about our people. We come from Cuba, we come from Haiti, we come from Mexico, we come from Eastern Europe, and no one tells us any stories about our ancestors. And they talk about the need for us to assimilate, right? That's the topic of your forthcoming book, which I'm so excited. And I really want to take this opportunity to invite you to the University of Florida to come and talk about the book when it comes out.
Thank you.
Because it's so important, Julissa, because we have been told for generations that we have to bend and break and assimilate into a dominant society, which is an imperialistic society. It's a racist society. And the reason that many of us are here, in fact, is because of American imperialism, right? Juan Gonzalez has the wonderful metaphor, harvest of empire. And what Gonzalez is trying to get us to understand, it's kind of like when Junot Diaz says, the reason I'm here, because my ancestors were from the Dominican Republic, but the reason I'm here, Diaz tells us, is that the U.S. invaded my country in 1965 and drove my people out. And so we ended up growing up in New York and New Jersey. So it's really all those reasons. And when I grew up, we didn't hear anything about the contributions of Mexican Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, African Americans. And I think I kind of tried to think about those stories in concert with each other. The amazing story of the African diaspora and the freedom struggle with the freedom struggles of our peoples, because they're so intertwined. And one anecdote I can share with you, one experience as a teacher, time after time, I will have students come into my office hours, and I can actually predict this now, Julissa. The lecture I give on the Mexican War of Independence, which we are just now celebrating, right? For Latinx Heritage Month, when I tell the story about how our war for independence started as a struggle against slavery, as a struggle against the oppression of indigenous peoples, in addition to being an independence struggle. And I tell them that, African Americans found sanctuary in Mexico even before Mexico won its independence from Spain. I'll have students, first-gen students from Mexico, and they will tell me, they'll say, and they'll come into my office, sometimes they're in tears, they're crying, they're saying, we never heard these stories. We now have a reason to be proud of where we came from. And, they shouldn't have to wait that long.
Yeah.
We should grow up with these stories. And I think sometimes we're almost embarrassed because we're trying so hard to somehow assimilate to a dominant kind of culture, a dominant narrative. It's kind of like when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said shortly before he passed away, why would I want to integrate onto a burning ship?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. Well, one of the things that your book really made me realize is that one of the biggest reasons for me of sort of assimilating in my earlier years as an immigrant to the country is because I felt like I didn't have a history here, right? And I think that as long as we continue to teach the same history, the same incomplete history, as long as we continue to teach that incomplete history, we are allowing white supremacy to continue, because we learn all through school, we learn all the stories of the white heroes of the United States. We learn the stories of the civilization of Europe, but we don't learn the things that you're teaching in your book, which I want to take a step back and just look at. You were briefly mentioning about the freedom struggles in Mexico and Haiti and Cuba and Latin America, and how those struggles were so different. And there was a very clear difference between the independence struggles in Latin America and the independence struggle of the United States. And I'm wondering if you could share some of the things that you share in your book about how those two freedom struggles were different.
The freedom struggles, there's similarities and then there's radical differences, right? And one of the radical differences is that if you talk about Cuba, you talk about Haiti, you talk about Mexico in the early 19th century, those freedom struggles are independent struggles, kind of like the American Revolution was an independent struggle, right? But the difference is they're profoundly anti-imperial struggles, or profoundly anti-racist struggles. And so what I mean by this is, if you look at the Mexican War of Independence, if you look at it carefully and you look at how armies were recruited to fight the Spanish. And the thing we have to understand, Julissa, if you go back to the early 19th century, my gosh, to take on the Spanish Empire was an astonishing, heroic thing. It's the mightiest empire still in the world. I mean, the British are going to eclipse the Spanish, but the Spanish are still on top. If you came to me and I was a peasant, I was an enslaved person, I was a mestizo or whatever, and you say, hey, take up arms against the Spanish Empire in 1810. Are you kidding me? What hope of success do you possibly have? But those wars were animated by this great idea, the idea of human equality, of human liberty, and not abstract. It was not an abstraction. And in writing African American and Latinx history of the United States, I went back and I looked at the papers and the correspondence of people like John Adams, like Alexander Hamilton, like Jefferson, because I wanted to make sure that my suspicions were true, and in fact they were. Jefferson, Adams, and Hamilton never planned a revolution which was going to give you or me equality with them. That was never their plan. Their plan was for us to be second class or third class citizens or enslaved people, right? But if you look at this, the Haitian liberation struggle, the Cuban struggle, Jose Marti, Antonio Maceo. I just talked to a group of high school students in Florida about those freedom fighters. From the very beginning, the idea was the equality of all people, and also challenging economic exploitation, and also challenging imperialism. Those three great goals. And that's what differentiates the Latin American independence struggles, Julissa. And let me give you one more example. When U.S. Americans talk about the deficits in our Constitution, when we talk about things like the Electoral College, we talk about endless wars, and they say, how are we going to solve this problem? And I've been all over the country to give lectures, and people get up in the first Q&A, how do we solve the problems, Professor Ortiz, that we have with our Constitution? And you know what I tell them? I say, why don't you look to our neighbor, Mexico? Look at the Mexican Constitution and look at that proud history of non-intervention. And I ask my audiences, I say, I just want to give you a pop quiz. I'm a historian, right? So I'm a professor. So, my pop quiz for you is, how many nations has Mexico carpet bombed? How many nations has Mexico invaded? And no, I'm not claiming that Mexico is perfect. It has flaws in either nation, right? But there's this proud and important and intellectual history of non-intervention which is rooted in the Mexican War of Independence, fighting an imperial nation. Unfortunately, the U.S., in contrast, we also were fighting an imperial nation, right, in 1776, trying to break free from a terrible, vicious, oppressive colonialism. But unfortunately, because of white supremacy, and you mentioned this in your preface, because of settler colonialism, we turned around and mimicked the worst behaviors of the British Empire. We mimicked the worst behaviors of the French Empire. We strengthened slavery instead of breaking it. And that's what people in Mexico and the Cuban liberation struggles and most of the Latin American independence struggles were able to do. So in the sense of advancing human rights, those struggles were far superior. And that superiority, by the way, continues well into the 20th century. But again, we're not taught those shining moments of emancipation. And if we're a society which says we're down with freedom and justice, wow, we have a lot to learn.
Right. Yeah, and I loved something else that you said, which was that if we really want to look for more perfect democracies, not that any of them are perfect, but a better example, that we need to look to Latin America as much as we look to Europe for those types of government and for examples of what true liberation or at least a struggle for true liberation was. One of the things that you said in your book was that the American struggle for independence was mostly fought by proprietary, I can't say that word, but people who own property, by people who own property to safeguard slavery, property, and political power. And in many ways, I think that the American independence was as much about freedom as it was about preserving a system of slavery. And it all goes back to what you were saying, which was about white supremacy and upholding white supremacy and upholding everything that white supremacy has its hands on. But I was listening, you mentioned Hamilton in the previous answer, and I was listening to a podcast interview that you did previously, and you talk about Hamilton, the musical. And you said something that, I mean, I had to like rewind and listen to it again, because I was like, he said what? But after you said it, I understood it. And you said that Hamilton the musical, which is I think a musical that a lot of people have embraced and love, both because Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote it and is behind it, and also because the majority of the cast are Black people and people of color, so we're seeing different type of representation. But ultimately, Hamilton the musical is a story about Hamilton, and you said that that Hamilton is a white nationalist production. So what do you mean by that?
Well, now you're going to get me into trouble, right? I mean, first of all, I love Lin-Manuel Miranda. I mean, one of the great artists of our time. I saw him actually being interviewed the other day, and he broke into like a rhyme. I was like, wow, you go, guy. I mean, it was incredible. So, and I've listened to the music, and, look, I mean, my wife and I are actually planning to watch the movie this weekend, Hamilton, and I tell people watch it. And I believe in the importance of representation, Julissa, in terms of, how Black and brown people have been excluded from Broadway for generations.
From every aspect of American society.
Exactly. And so, we have to give major props there. The problem is that, and Lin-Manuel Miranda has actually recently admitted this, that he got the story wrong, that Hamilton is not a character that we should have seen on stage being portrayed as kind of a proto-abolitionist. That's just not true. And I think Ishmael Reed has done this in a real gentle manner. Ishmael Reed is one of the great novelists of our time. And he wrote a wonderful play, which actually premiered at the New York Poets Cafe in New York recently.
An iconic place.
Yeah, it's called The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. And it's a very gentle kind of story where it's patterned after Charles Dickens's Christmas Carol. And Miranda is kind of haunted by these different characters that are not in Hamilton. An enslaved African-American woman who actually was a slave of the Schuyler sisters, who were portrayed in the documentary, a Native American who Hamilton frequently depicted Native Americans as savages, as people to be wiped out, right? A poor white person, and all the people who are not depicted in Hamilton. And what Ishmael says is, you know, look, Miranda was kind of fooled by a group of unfortunately, academic historians to try to create a Hamilton who did not exist in reality. And, you know, as the play, and I've read part of the script, and the play ends, or the musical ends, and there's this allusion to, well, if Hamilton could have lived longer, he might have become an abolitionist, right? Well, the problem with that is that, I mean, if you wanted to write a musical about a real abolitionist during that time, you know, write about, you know, Jose Maria Morelos of Mexico, who actually was an abolitionist. Write about Thomas Paine, who was a real abolitionist. And I think that I call it, I stand by that depiction. You made me flinch a little bit when you said white. I mean, here's the thing, Julissa. I mean, again, I'll go back to my own experiences. When I was a kid in first and second grade, they used to dress up the little kids of color in white wigs. And they used to have us pretend that we were George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams. And I don't remember. I mean, it was stressful for me because I can never remember my lines. I mean, but, you know, I got to wonder, how long are we going to continue doing that kind of thing? You know, why don't we have a musical that portrays people like, you know, like Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titan of Cuba, or Dolores Huerta, who's 90 years young, you know, who's one of the characters of all American history. Why do we have to kind of have a fantasy about Alexander Hamilton, who really hated us? If you look at his correspondence, he had no love for us, and none of the fathers did that. That's the thing that I'm trying to get people to understand. Insofar as you and I enjoy the rights that we have now, the wonderful books you've written, what I've been able to do as a teacher, the founding fathers didn't have those fates in store for us. They saw you and I as workforces. Never saw us as being able to participate equally as citizens. It's our ancestors who made those rights and responsibilities possible, you know, beginning in Latin America, beginning in the Caribbean, beginning in Africa. And that's why I kind of, you know, chapter 1 of the book is the Haitian Revolution, because I want to decenter this white supremacist narrative of American history. Look, all of our peoples in Mexico, we have testimony. If anyone doubts this, Simon Bolivar, the great liberator of Central America, Venezuela, Jose Morelos, Vicente Guerrero, the list goes on and on. They all give major props, not to the founding fathers, but to the Haitians. Haitian Revolution, which breaks the back of slavery and imperialism in the Americas. It's the first independent free republic that's created in the entire.
Isn't that crazy that people don't know that? People don't realize that it was liberation started in Haiti. And that was the beacon of hope for so many people. It was Haiti that was the beacon of hope for freedom for so many people, not the United States, and particularly not at that time when slavery was, you know, the reason, one of the reasons that the United States even exists.
Exactly. You know, the settler colonialism. And I want people, you know, people often ask me what books I suggest them to read. And I say, read the most important history book I've read in my entire adult lifetime, Julissa, is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. I highly suggest that book because it tells us where the U.S. went wrong. You connect, you know, the oppression of indigenous peoples, settler colonialism, to slavery. Those three things you cannot untangle from each other. The U.S. steamrolls into Mexico. It invades Mexico. And by the way, when I was a kid growing up, they called it the what do they call it?
The Mexican-American War.
My gosh. And some kids still use that term. And, you know, I talked to a group of teachers the other day about it. They asked me to do a high school history workshop. And the one thing I want to let you know, which I think you'll be happy about, is, my gosh, school districts across this country now are getting the news. Their students, teachers, parents are demanding a new kind of history. But I looked at one of their lesson plans, and they had this phrase, the Mexican-American War. I said, stop, y'all, stop. It wasn't the Mexican-American, it was the U.S. invasion of Mexico to grow slavery.
Yep.
That's what John Quincy Adams called it. That's what Abraham Lincoln called it. That's what the people in power at the time were very honest about. And it's just that in recent years, historians, and again, that's why, again, I don't blame Lin-Manuel Miranda for his interpretation of Hamilton, because, again, he leaned on people like us in the academy, academic historians.
Right.
We have been predominantly a white nationalist profession. And we're only now really trying to break free of those bonds. I mean, I have to pinch myself all the time, because I go into a classroom and I start, the propaganda, Julissa, is so intense.
Yeah.
I remember walking into a Florida classroom back in 2008, and this is an embarrassing story. I walk in, I have a U.S. history textbook, and the theme that week was isolationism. And I started talking about, well, you know, the U.S. was an isolationist nation until, and then a student raised her hand. She was a Haitian American student, and she said, "Excuse me, professor, I'm Haitian, and the U.S. has instituted a blockade of Haiti the moment we gained our independence in 1804." You know, and another student, a Cuban American student, said, "Well, you know, we were going to get our independence, and the U.S. invaded us. So what's this whole thing about isolationism? We don't understand. Can you break that down for us?" And I had to check myself. I'm like, wow, I've swallowed the white nationalist Kool-Aid, because as woke as I thought I was in 2008, I was still teaching that kind of old colonial, you know, master mindset.
It's funny because I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because there are different points in my next book, Rejecting Assimilation, where I do refer to the intervention of the United States as the Mexican-American War. So I'm so glad you said that, because it's still something I can change and make sure I don't call it that. In Mexico, because I grew up in Mexico, and so I studied, I had some history lessons in Mexico, and we called it La Intervención Estadounidense. Right, which translates into the intervention of the United States, because that's what it was. The thing about Hamilton, what had really stood out to me in that podcast was sort of the way that you framed it as it's one story, but the problem is not so much the telling of that story, but the fact that those are the only stories we continue to tell, and therefore, like, we never learn about the heroes that exist in our community that our ancestors were. I have a couple more questions for you, and I'll make them brief, because I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, I would just wait until I cue you to ask your question, because there's so many comments that they're kind of getting lost. But so if you have a specific question, just hang on 1 second and then ask it, because we do want to take questions from the audience. So one of the other things that you kind of alluded to right now, which is how the U.S. intervened in so many different places. And I think that's one aspect of U.S. history that's often hidden, not just how imperfect our union really is and the principles on which it was founded are also imperfect, but how the U.S. also actively stopped freedom in Latin America and the Caribbean. You write that the progress of anti-slavery insurgencies in Haiti and Mexico and other parts of Latin America filled U.S. political leaders with dread. So can you give us, you kind of gave us the example of Cuba, and you mentioned the Dominican Republic, which, I think so many of us don't even understand the scope of intervention. Like, I had no idea that the U.S. at one point had invaded Haiti, the Philippines, like so many places. And so can you give us a couple of examples of when the U.S. intervened to kind of stop freedom in other places, in Latin American places? And also, how did U.S. leaders viewing us as racially inferior shape their strategy in Latin America? I mean, when I read some of those correspondences that you're talking about, that you wrote about, it made my skin crawl when we were referred to as, savages, when the founding fathers would say that we were not racially capable of having our own governments and governing ourselves. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I'll start from the first part of your question. So let's just take one year, 1915. So that year, the U.S. invaded or occupied Haiti, and soon after did the same thing to the neighboring Dominican Republic. And they did that ostensibly to protect American property, but the real reason was to help U.S. banks cement their control over Caribbean finance. And what I mean by this is an early example of what economic scholars now call financialization. What U.S. banks wanted to take control of was the respective debts of each society. Because as we know now, in the wake of the 2008 Great Recession rather, debt is a powerful financial instrument, right?
Yeah, and we'll be talking about the Puerto Rican debt with Ed Morales next week.
Exactly.
But continue.
Yeah, I'm so glad that he's an amazing person. So yeah, in 1915, the U.S. goes in and really at the behest of New York-based banks to take over the society, to take over Haiti's budget. They do this. We do the same thing with the Dominican Republic. And one of the things I learned in writing African American and Latinx history of the United States is I learned pretty quickly, can't trust the New York Times to talk honestly about U.S. foreign policy. Can't trust the Washington Post. And if you look at the history of those mainstream, I'll call them Anglo newspapers, because that's what they always have been, frankly, they have always been on the side of U.S. intervention. So why is that? You know, we should ask ourselves that question. But Julissa, on the other side, what I discovered was when I looked at Black newspapers from 1915, they were telling the truth. They broke it down. They said, why would the U.S. claim to be going to Haiti and Nicaragua, Honduras, to bring democracy to those countries? What a bad joke. The U.S. doesn't care about democracy. We can't even vote in our own country. And so you're talking about democracy in Haiti or the Dominican Republic? And so that was a humbling lesson for me to learn, that I had been looking for history in all the wrong places. And I needed to look at Black newspapers. And just like this earlier time period you mentioned about what the founding fathers, how they conceived people from Latin America, they saw us as little better than savages. They said, and because periodically there would be popular American support for people like Simón Bolívar, right? He was considered to be an international hero. But again, the so-called founding fathers and their sons basically said, don't admire Simón Bolívar, or don't support what's happening in Mexico. That's not like our independence struggle, because those savages there, those Indians and mixed people, and that's how they referred us to as and they came up with a lot of derogatory terms with here. They don't understand freedom. They don't have a sense of responsibility. This is why I was so glad to learn about this incredible Mexican-American, Californio Mexicano tradition of abolitionism. And I try to talk about this in the book, you know, these incredible, like, we know about Frederick Douglass. Everyone should know Frederick Douglass was. But what I try to do is introduce people to the great Mexican and Mexican-American abolitionists in California who are writing in Spanish language newspapers vicious denunciations of American colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. And so you have these dueling freedom struggles, you know, if you will. And the last thing I'll say about this, Julissa, is that if you want to understand 19th century U.S. political history, here's the most important fact. All of the nations that we've been talking about so far, even the imperialist nations, even France, even Great Britain, the Dutch, all of them are moving towards abolition of slavery in the early 19th, early 1800s. Alone out of those, it's the U.S. and the Portuguese and Brazil who are moving in the opposite direction. We're moving towards empire. We're moving towards expanding slavery. And if you look at Brazil today and the United States today, we're almost like uncomfortably mirrored images of each other in certain ways, right? You know, we have right-wing governments. We have governments which have been complicit in the suppression of civil liberties. We have governments which have smashed Black neighborhoods. immigrant neighborhoods. We have governments which have been nativist. And so again, that's a really important thing to understand. I mean, think about the U.S. in the 1840s. By the 1840s, the British Empire's outlawed slavery. The French Empire's outlawed slavery. The Seminoles are fighting a desperate battle with their African American allies in Florida to keep slavery out of Florida, right? And Mexico has abolished slavery decades earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And many African Americans are finding sanctuary and freedom in Mexico and in the Bahamas and in even Martinique, right? And it's the U.S. who's still trying, because the U.S., to be honest, slavery was too profitable for to get shed of. And all these other nations said, we're going to abolish it, but it was just too profitable for the U.S. And that really created a set of attitudes and behaviors towards property and towards the value of human life that I think we're grappling with now. And the reason why we have to have a Black Lives Matter movement at this late date, to even just affirm the idea that Black
Lives Matter.
Can you imagine, after Black people have been brought here in chains in the 1500s, and over 400 years later, you have to have a movement to affirm that Black Lives Matter? The society should be ashamed that we're in that. But I will say, on the positive side, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened so many new spaces for us to talk about our histories, Julissa. And the last thing I'll say is that I have more Latinx and Hispanic and Chicanx, history events this month than ever in my entire career.
Great.
And I really credit it to the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's opened our hearts and our minds to the histories of oppressed people, and it's really made a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really, I mean, we're here talking about Latinx history, which of course is also Black history, because we can't forget that, like, there are, and we are going to talk about later in the series specifically about Black Latinos and Black Latino history. But one of the things that really stood out to me specifically about your book, and sort of that the African American struggle, it's also just how much African Americans supported freedom struggles everywhere else in the world, even as they were fighting for their own freedom here in the United States, and how they had this idea of international emancipatory internationalism. And I want to get to the questions from the audience, but so we won't have time to talk about that. And plus, everybody should get the book. You can see how many notes I made, because I learned so much from this book. But the last question I want to ask you before we open it up to Q&A is that, we're currently in the midst of a reckoning, I think, within our community, facing issues of racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous sentiments within our own Latinx community. And, we're wrestling with our colonial history, with the caste system that defined society in colonial times. And I think part of eradicating that racism within our community is to understand the dynamics that created it. So I want to just take a quick step back, because in reading your book, you alluded to a lot of these figures, leaders like Vicente Guerrero, Jose Marti, and others who fought against slavery, who fought for the right of Black and Indigenous people. You write that generations of people in the U.S. drew inspiration and lessons from the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence, the Cuban War of Liberation. So where did we go wrong? Because I often feel, I'm often dumbfounded by how we Latinos are part of an oppressed group, and yet we are also some of the worst oppressors within our own community, and particularly towards Black people, particularly towards Indigenous people. So where do we go wrong? Because I feel like when I'm reading this stuff, it's like night and day of what our ancestors were fighting for and what they stood for, and some of the issues that are so prevalent in our community.
Where do we go wrong? I mean, it's an important question. Well, I'd like to start with the concept of self-hatred. It's a family question, because, again, I didn't grow up learning this history. I didn't learn to be proud of my ancestors. I kind of knew they had fought in the Mexican Revolution, but I didn't quite know what they had done. It was never presented in a book. It was never presented in a lesson plan. It wasn't talked about in our churches, our organizations, not in the Boy Scouts. Even in the Boy Scouts, you learn about Alexander Hamilton yet again, right? So that led to a level, we used to call this, and I'll borrow from my dear friend and colleague, Ibram Kendi, who wrote the wonderful How to Be an Anti-Racist. Ibram talks about
who wrote you a beautiful blurb. So he supports the book. You guys should buy the book. I'm just going to put it up here for a second because people were asking about the name of it. So. Thank you.
Well, Ibram is too kind, but Ibram Kendi tells us that even as a young Black boy growing up, he imbibed this image of denigration about Black people because it was so dominant in the society. And I think that's where I begin is we don't learn our own histories. We've forgotten our freedom struggles. Look, I had to learn most of the material, Julissa, in that book as an adult. I didn't know that growing up. I didn't know that when I was your age. And the other thing I want to report is that, well, first I want to talk about Spanish colonialism for just a minute. The Spanish imposed a horrific system of racism onto indigenous America. And when they grafted slavery onto that, they kind of hyped it. And so in the Spanish Empire, to be non-white was to be a punishment and a denigration in and of itself. It meant you were subjected to draconian punishments. You were subjected to physical, to whipping, to beatings. It meant you couldn't become a skilled craftsperson. You couldn't even become a carpenter if you were an indigenous person in the Spanish Empire because of the casta system. So after centuries, we overthrew the Spanish, we overthrew the Portuguese, we overthrew the Dutch, so on and so forth. And yet those habits of mental slavery still stayed in our communities. And we brought them with us. We bring these kind of mixed legacies. So on the one hand, I would argue we bring social democracy to the United States. That's one of our great gifts. If you look at the leadership of the most progressive trade unions in this country, almost all of them led by young Latina, Latinx women, most of them first generation from Central America, from Mexico, from
the future is Latina.
Exactly. And the other thing I want to mention is that oppression does not always generate solidarity, right? Because we live in a racial capitalist system, which has always been based on the notion of divide and conquer. The good news is that in Florida, which we have a very distinctive Hispanic communities, right?
Yeah.
I have spent many hours just in the past year going physically to Miami-Dade when I could, or Hialeah or Fort Lauderdale, now via Zoom, working with amazing groups, local Latinx community organizers who have held anti-Black, how to defeat anti-Black racism in our communities, and how anti-Black racism cripples us, and it eliminates our ability to grapple successfully with white supremacy, because we have to remember that our struggles are really bound up with economic justice struggles.
Right.
We're a working class people. We always will be. I mean, I've been blessed to become a history professor, but the reality is that most Black and brown people for the rest of our lives will be working class people. And capitalism is a system which is inherently oppressive,
right,
and it's created these pressures on us, and it's created these kind of divide and conquer pressures. But I would argue that's not really who we are. And if we remember our histories, we remember, and you don't have to be a radical to understand the importance of mutual aid societies in Mexico in the 18th century, the 19th century. You don't have to be radical to understand the system, the beautiful system of village democracy, which brought into being people like Emiliano Zapata. He was an elected leader of his village even before the Mexican Revolution of the 20th century. And the system of leadership that elected him to a position of leadership, which catapulted him into world leadership, it was centuries old. It preceded European imperialism. And the Mexican Revolution, by the way, I want to say, give a shout out to my dear friend and colleague, Christina Heatherton, who is on the cusp of actually publishing a book, which is going to demonstrate once and for all that the Mexican Revolution of the 20th century was the most important revolution of the 20th century. And in fact, for oppressed people, even superseded the Russian Revolution. Because, and it was a bloody revolution. Yes, I mean, it was the revolution that my family, fled from. It cost more than a 1.5 million lives, right? But it gave us so many things. It gave us a constitution based on non-intervention, right? Anti-imperialism. It gave us a constitution which articulated the equality of women. It gave us a constitution which articulated land reform. It gave us a constitution which articulated the dignity of working, of labor. And from the minute it was framed, the U.S. and again the European powers intervened to try to stunt it the way that they did to Haiti in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. Because for some reason, our leaders in New York and D.C. and places can't let us alone, right? Just can't let us alone. I mean, the last thing I'll mention is, we talk about Haiti, and a lot of people talk about the Haitian Revolution, right? And we understand now, hopefully, its importance. But would you be surprised if I told you that the concept of equality between nations, connected to the concept of the equality within nations, was actually invented by the Haitians? They're the ones that came up with the idea. And that's the reason that the U.S. has worked so hard to try to get us to believe that, Haiti and Mexico are so backwards.
Right. There were like these third world countries where nothing good comes from, but, what that guy said, which is totally untrue. Yeah, there was so many, and we're getting close to our time. So if you do have a question, please, this is a time to put it in the comments so that I can pick a couple of questions and we can keep picking Dr. Ortiz's brain. I know for me, when I was reading this book, like there were so many light bulbs that went off, and just while I wait for questions to come in, one of the big light bulbs that went off when I was reading the book was how so many of these freedom fights and revolutions were also about owning property, and like owning property as like almost like a human right? Like, this is our land, we should own property. And I was just thinking how now how difficult it is to own property, particularly in places like where I live in California and Los Angeles. Like in my neighborhood, houses are, $1.5 million, $2 million, $3 million houses. And so I was thinking, like, I was like, man, I used to think like, whatever, if I don't own a home, I don't own a home. But now I'm like, no, it is like my human right to own land. And so I'm like, I am going to buy a house now. So thank you, because that's the light bulb that went off when I was reading. One of the many, by the way, one of the many. So here's the question. We answered a lot of them actually, because when we were people were asking about what you thought about Black Lives Matter, which you've already talked about. Anna, I'm wondering if you could put the link back in the comments to Creating Conversations link, where people can buy Dr. Ortiz's book, because people were asking just where they could buy it and where the name of what the name of the book was. I did see that question. So what are doctors, what are your thoughts on DACA and its current state under the Trump presidency? And just, I think more broadly, what are your kind of thoughts on the current sort of immigration crisis that we're going through?
We have to fight like heck to defend our brothers and sisters who don't have full immigration rights. The way I see it is we have over 12 million people who are so-called undocumented citizens. Not all of them are from Latin America. Some of them are from Africa, Eastern Europe, and other places. And I see that this is kind of the new Jim Crow, to borrow by Michelle Alexander. Why does racial capitalism depend upon disenfranchising millions of workers every generation? Basta ya, we got to stop this. We got to defend DACA. And I have a lot of students who have been undocumented, who are now, younger labor leaders, attorneys, before it was the AB 540 system in California, where I taught for many years. And we just have to defend what we have. Don't lose, or don't cede 1 inch, right? Defend DACA, but at the same time, look at expanding it and look at full amnesty. I'm not going to be happy until we get there.
Yeah, and I think people are like scared of the word amnesty, and I'm like, no, like, I mean, I know that the right has like weaponized the word amnesty, but I'm like, that is what we need. Actually.
Our labor built this nation, and if you look at the 1980s, Julissa, everyone, look, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Restaurant Industry Association, the Grocers Associations were begging for workers. They put out the word in all of our nations in Latin America. We need workers. We don't have enough labor, right? And so we answered their call by the millions. And many of us, as Juan Gonzalez has taught, were chased out of our own countries. Central America, look, I was a soldier in U.S. Special Forces in the mid-'80s. I was part of the problem, right? And we promoted civil wars in Central America. We drove people out of their own nations. And so how on earth is it up to us to decide who is not and who is a citizen for a person who has worked here 20, 25, 30, 40 years? I mean, it's really sad. And I know this is controversial, because even within my own family, I have people who are like, hey, we worked hard in our generation, Paul, but this new generation of Mexican Americans are just so lazy. We have to fight that within our own families.
Yeah.
It's so easy, again, within that capitalist divide and conquer mentality. You mentioned property, right? Okay, so I own a house. I don't see anything wrong with that. It's security for my family, right? But when is enough, right? We have this growing class of billionaires and, all these corporations making money out of our communities. And they're the ones who are trying to stop immigration reform. So let's build a movement. I mean, let's get Trump out of office. Yes.
First and foremost, I hope everyone's registered to vote.
But at the same time, let's not be ashamed to use the term amnesty. My gosh, Ronald Reagan used the term amnesty in the 1980s. And, again, if you believe in hard work, who are the hardest working people in the history of the society? Number one, enslaved African Americans, right, and their descendants. And we're pretty much a close second, I would argue. I mean, we're for our keep, and we've done. And that's why I say in the book, we should not be ashamed of who we are. And I think that's the biggest problem, because of the shame we have and we've been made to feel, and we've kind of incorporated. We're shy about asserting ourselves.
Yeah.
Let's stop with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. There's so many questions. I just want to briefly say there's a question about the census and the fact that there's the racial categories are such that so many Latinos feel like the only choice we have is to check white on it when it comes to our racial, like, what race are we? And I just wanted to briefly say that we are going to be speaking with Dr. Laura Gomez, who wrote Inventing Latinos and Manifest Destinies, the Making of the Mexican American Race. And so there we're going to have a really, really deep discussion about precisely that question, and how Latinos came to be ethnicity instead of a race, and what that means for us. So I just wanted to answer that question very briefly, which just to say, tune in September 30th, because that's when we'll be speaking with Dr. I have a random question. Are all PhDs doctors?
Well, yeah, or professors. I mean, she's wonderful. I'm going to be tuning into that show. Julissa.
Awesome.
She's
September 30th.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's amazing. She's really, really great. So, okay, so there is a question sort of, it's not a specific question, because there's a lot of questions that are alluding to this, which is, how do we begin to decolonize our history and what we teach children in school? And I know that you have exciting news about your book. So I'm wondering if you can share some of, like, what can we do to start decolonizing our textbooks?
Now is the time. And again, the Black Lives Matter movement has opened this space. There were movements beforehand. Let me share with you what's happening in Connecticut. So the state of Connecticut has passed a law. All public school graduates will take courses in African American history, Latinx history, and Puerto Rican history. not an elective, a requirement. And that came about, Julissa, because of a student movement, a parent movement, a teacher movement. Whether or not we're teachers or not, we can demand that our school districts teach more inclusive histories. We can demand that if we're living in a district where 65% of the kids are of Dominican descent, that by gosh, there should be units about teaching the history of the Dominican Republic, right? You don't have to be a PhD to demand that. There's more space now. And in Miami-Dade, my brothers and sisters listening, and I know there's some tonight from Miami-Dade, we just had a revolutionary moment just a little over a month ago. Miami-Dade has now made it official that African-American and Latino histories will be taught. And there was argument about it, and some people said, well, Black history, is it communistic, we know, but those arguments lost. And so it was, again, because of a popular movement of parents, students, and teachers. It's happening all over the country. This is so exciting to see demands for more inclusive curricula. As a teacher, I am so excited to see students, even when they walk out of class going on strike, demanding what? The right to study more.
Yeah.
My gosh.
That's awesome.
And, I mean, I'm happy to also share that because of that demand created by students. And we always have to remember our freedom movements have been propelled by three groups of people: young people, high school aged, working class people like your mom. You wrote a wonderful blog post. Your mom had a 6th grade education, right? My father had a 7th grade education, right? He was one more year advanced than your mother, but though it was the working class people that created the farm worker movement. It was the working class people that created the new immigrant rights movement of today. Mm-hmm. And then the third group of people are the people that are kind of watching this show right now. They're people who are, we're kind of in these uncomfortable spaces. So, you're a noted author now. I'm a professor. I know you have imposter syndrome. I have it too. I sometimes wake up and say, what am I doing? A university professor? My gosh. But there's roles for all three of those groups: really young people, working class people, and people like us to get involved. The spaces are there more than ever. And the last thing I'll share with you, I was talking to a school superintendent. I won't call her name. She is a superintendent of a school district that serves about 200,000 students in public schools. And she was telling me she had read African American and Latinx histories in the United States. And I just shared with her that Beacon Press, my wonderful publisher, is actually in the process of creating a young adult version of an African American Latinx history in the United States, which will be geared towards middle school and younger high school students. And she said, Paul, I'm beginning, she goes, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago, but you know what? I think the United States needs a revolution. What do you think? And I was like, okay, wait for it. And I said, well, ma'am, I think you may be right. But I mean, a mainstream superintendent who's saying this, we need a revolution. And that's exactly what this country needs. And so we're waking up everywhere. It's so exciting to see, the work that you have done, your magnificent appearance and statements on the Oprah Winfrey Show, which said, again, you said with your mind what so many of us have been thinking, but afraid to say. We need to start representing ourselves. We need to teach young people. Now I'm going to sound like the conservative teacher, right? Teach our children how to write, how to speak, how to represent themselves. Writing is to the 21st century what public speaking was to the 20th century, right? Because you have Twitter, you have all these platforms that require us to write. Write concisely. So you're the perfect role model for where we need to go, in the 21st century.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your time. Everyone tuning in, thank you so much. I was thinking recently that we need to change our thinking around like self-promotion and like what that means. But I'm not afraid to tell you that if you want to support my work, you can pick up my book, My Underground American Dream. It's also in the same link where you can find Dr. Ortiz's book, an African-American and Latinx history of the United States. Dr. Ortiz, thank you so much. I mean, I could keep talking to you for many more hours, but I'm so thankful that you took the time to join us. I am so grateful to every single person that, by the way, Dr. Ortiz, my goal is that this will not be the only 4 conversations that we have. I am hoping that we have a second season of this series, and I hope that you will be back.
I would love to be back, and thank you again for the honor. It's really an amazing experience. I'm excited. I'll be tuning in. So I encourage everyone here, Laura and other people on the series are just going to be amazing people. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So yes, we hope to see you next week for the second episode of La Historia Uncovered. Again, if you're posting, and I hope that you do, I hope that you help us to spread the word. This is as much something as that I created, but it's something that we're all creating together. And so I hope that you help us to get the word out. Please post about this episode. Use the hashtag La Historia Uncovered. Next week, we'll be speaking with Ed Morales, who is the author of Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico. We'll be discussing the colonial history of Puerto Rico, why Puerto Ricans have what he calls the second-class citizenship status, and how Hurricane Maria exposed everything that has been bubbling up in Puerto Rico for a long time, for centuries, really. I want to just say a huge thank you again to our partners, We All Grow, Latino Rebels, Puede, and BESE. And thank you so much. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.